Either you fully back Ukraine materially and rhetorically, or you don't, and you let Russia do what it will. Flip-flopping only leads to a longer war, and while that does crush the Russian economy and military stockpiles, it also kills thousands more soldiers on both sides. More than 4 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia occupies roughly 20% of the country after gaining almost 5,000 square kilometers in 2025. Which sounds like a lot, but it's really only an average gain of a few miles stretched across hundreds of miles of mostly open fields, so it's not actually that significant. Last weekend, Russia and Ukraine agreed to a 3-day ceasefire and prisoner exchange mediated by the US to swap 1,000 prisoners of war each, 250 of which have been swapped, and allow Russia to hold Victory Day celebrations in Moscow unhindered. Due to past ceasefires broken by the Russians, Vladimir Zelensky said he didn't feel any need to uphold the ceasefire declared by Russia for their Victory Day celebrations. However, Russia had threatened to launch massive retaliatory strikes if Ukraine attacked Russia during the holiday. This led the US to broker the official 3-day ceasefire supported by the Ukrainians. But as you would expect, the fire didn't truly cease. Offensive and defensive strikes from both sides were significantly fewer, but not zero, leading both governments to accuse each other of violating the agreement. Ukrainian officials said that Russian forces conducted more than 150 ground assaults, 100 artillery strikes, and almost 10,000 drone strikes between May 9th and 10th. The Russian Ministry of Defense, in turn, accused Ukraine of 676 artillery and mortar strikes, as well as 6,300 drone strikes. Graphics from the Institute for the Study of War do show reductions in strikes, particularly in the northern regions of Ukraine, but only slight reductions along the forward line of troops in the east. Entering into its 5th year of conflict, we've seen relatively minimal gains on either side for some time now. The ceasefire was problematically vague and lacked well-defined terms. The only publicly available details of the ceasefire offered by Vladimir Zelensky stated that Ukraine would not strike Moscow's Red Square during the Kremlin's Victory Day parade, a condition that Ukraine did follow. But continued localized strikes from the beginning of the ceasefire highlights the fact that ceasefires without explicit enforcement mechanisms, credible monitoring, and defined dispute resolution processes are not going to hold up very well in highly contested areas, as many people would suspect. The Kremlin held its 2026 Victory Day parade in Moscow on May 9th in a much more simplified format than previous years, with the parade lasting only 45 minutes and featuring no tanks or other military equipment for the first time since 2007, also hosting only 10 foreign leaders as compared to over 20 in 2025. The parade also featured North Korean soldiers for the first time ever, after 10,000 of them joined Russian forces in repelling Ukraine's Kursk offensive in winter and spring 2025, suffering very high casualties and eventually being withdrawn. But the Kremlin is aware of the Russian populace's attitude towards the growing costs of the war, as casualties approach 1% of Russia's total population. However, in Vladimir Putin's Victory Day speech, he caught a lot of people off guard by saying something quite unusual, that he believed that the matter of the Ukrainian conflict was coming to an end. This comment, Putin's first real indication that his war might be nudging towards a conclusion, was the first time he chose not to toe the maximalist line, that the special military operation must continue until its goals are met. Instead, Putin chose to reflect the prevailing sentiment in Russia, supported by recent opinion polls, that the war needs to end soon. That moment of realism dissipated very quickly in the days following the ceasefire. Immediately after the weekend ceasefire ended, Russia launched over 1,500 drones into Ukraine, largely targeting Kyiv and hitting many residential buildings. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov from the Kremlin countered Putin's speech on May 13th by saying that a full Ukrainian withdrawal from Russian-claimed territory is a precondition for any further negotiations, and the Financial Times reported that Putin plans to impose additional territorial demands in any future ceasefire agreement. Yet his territorial ambitions and demands run completely counter to battlefield reality. Ukraine has consistently held the northern parts of the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblast since the beginning of the war, and while Russian commanders may believe that they can take the rest of the Donbass by the fall, according to anonymous sources, the slowing rate of Russian advances and increasing drone attacks into Russia by the Ukrainians take the demands further out of the realm of reality. Not that Russian commanders sitting safe in the Kremlin ever cared about reality. On the other side, Ukrainian defense successes on the battlefield and recent counterattacks have prevented Russian forces from making significant advances across the theater. Russia is having to choose between allocating manpower and equipment for offensive priorities and defending against Ukrainian counters, something they didn't originally plan for. Putin coincidentally didn't talk about any operational successes in Ukraine during his Victory Day celebrations, and instead simply claimed that Russian victory is inevitable. As I mentioned in the beginning, Russian forces have failed to make any operationally significant advances in the last year, mainly managing to seize Toretsk in August 2025 after a 14-month campaign, Seversk in a 41-month campaign, and Pokrovsk in January 2026 after a 2-year campaign, all of which resulted in high Russian casualties and equipment losses. Russian forces continue to suffer increasing casualty rates. Russian opposition outlets Medusa and Mediazona reported that data from numerous Russian registers and sources indicate that at least 350,000 Russian service members have died since Russia launched its invasion in February 2022. Russian courts only put that number around 90,000 service members missing and presumed dead, but obviously the actual number of Russian service members killed in action is likely much higher because these outlets have to give conservative estimates due to reporting limitations. Total Russian casualties killed and seriously wounded are reportedly 1.3 million as of February, according to a briefing from a NATO official as well as a separate analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Russian forces used the ceasefire last weekend to conduct rotations, provide reinforcements, and tighten up logistics throughout the occupied territory, possibly staging for imminent future offensive operations. Ukrainian military sources reported that Russian forces used the ceasefire for these things specifically in the Kupiansk, Lyman, and Slovyansk directions, and in the northern Kharkiv Oblast. Russian forces are strongly pressing an offensive to seize these remaining parts of Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region, which Moscow has demanded Kyiv cede before it considers ending the war. US-backed peace talks between Kyiv and Moscow have been bogged down by those demands, as well as demands over control of Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia, currently occupied by the Russians. Last year, Ukraine seemed to be the ones on the ropes, lacking resources and questioning the support of their most important ally. But things may have changed for a couple of reasons. First, Russia's collapse of national morale is perceptible. In a highly censored police state, that really only happens when a critical mass of disenchantment begins to see itself as the majority, and gains enough confidence to make it known. Putin has survived vocal criticism of his war before, when leader of the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, led a short coup in 2023. But now he's running out of convicts or impoverished Russians to send into poorly planned meat grinder assaults, and is also struggling to lure students from the middle classes into the ranks. The Russian economy is feeling the strain now more than ever. Russian oligarchs must be irritated enough to make Putin feel obligated to placate them with the suggestion that the war may be coming to a close. According to the Financial Times, Russia cut its economic growth forecast for this year from 1.3% to 0.4%, despite rising energy prices. Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak blamed labor shortages, excessive government spending, and Western sanctions for the reduction. After several years of growth fueled by military spending, the economy shrank by 0.3% in the first 3 months of the year, the first contraction since 2023. Either way, Putin may have the last laugh over irritated oligarchs as he continues to use charges of corruption as a pretext to nationalize private assets, possibly in retaliation for lack of support or to increase state revenue, or both. Russian billionaire Vadim Moshkovich's most valuable asset and now Russia's largest agricultural holding, Rusagro, was seized by Russia's prosecutor general on May 5th. On the Ukrainian side, the ceasefire gave little relief. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia had refrained from large-scale aerial and missile attacks, but continued assaults along the parts of the front where its forces are advancing. He said in an address that the Russian army is not observing any silence on the front and is not even trying to, and Ukrainian troops continue to respond to attacks and defend their positions. However, the desire in Moscow for a ceasefire surrounding the Victory Day celebrations does show Kyiv that there is a real fear of Ukrainian drone attacks as far into the Russian interior as Moscow, and that in itself shows the effectiveness of Ukrainian technological warfare, or the ineffectiveness of Russian air defenses. Either option gives Kyiv more leverage in any future negotiations. Both Russia and Ukraine are shifting towards a more proactive approach by conducting deep strikes against each other's drone production facilities, as the focus on drone attacks continues to increase. Back in 2024, Ukraine launched its largest drone attack on Russian territory, attempting to target Moscow. And a month later, Ukrainian drones penetrated deep into Russian territory, reaching Kazan. They continue to go after Russian critical infrastructure, targeting oil refineries, depots, and gas processing plants, targeting Russia's only real source of income. These strikes have increased in recent months as both sides attempt to counter opposing drones before they can even be built. However, the scale of impact seems to tip in the favor of Ukrainians, as Russian drone production is more centralized in large production facilities, that are much more easily identified and targeted. One of the most prominent attacks occurred on April 19th when Ukrainian forces struck the Atlant Aero facility in Taganrog using Neptune cruise missiles. The strikes on the facility were part of the broader campaign against Russia's drone manufacturing network. Later, in April, Ukrainian forces targeted a special-purpose center in occupied Zaporizhia that involves the development of drones, robotic systems, and electronic warfare technologies. Ukraine is also expanding this campaign beyond drone assembly plants to target key enabling technologies and supply chains as well. On May 5th, Ukrainian missiles and drones struck a plant near Cheboksary in Russia, which produces navigation receivers and antennas used in several Russian drone systems. And immediately after Russia's barrage of drones into Kyiv last week, Ukraine launched their own attack against one of their largest oil refineries, again hoping to slow down their money supply. Foreign investment remains the key leverage Kyiv has over Moscow in any resolution to the conflict. Since 2022, Ukraine has or plans to receive about $188 billion in aid from the US and $197 billion from the EU, including roughly $65 billion in immediate military aid from the US. Now, to quickly refute a common talking point, these valuations are not blank checks, or generally checks at all. While the valuations do include some financial assistance to keep their economy from completely collapsing, to buy new weapon systems, and to provide humanitarian aid, the majority of the value comes by systems and munitions given from our pre-existing stockpile. Stockpiles that have been deemed expendable at the moment and technically can have expiration dates depending on what munition you're talking about, so you might as well give them to someone that has a use for it. The actions and rhetoric of Western nations, and the Trump administration especially, matter a lot in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Trump isn't actually wrong when he says that Ukraine and Vladimir Zelensky don't have the cards. We're propping up their entire country and have been since the beginning. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but you can't then waffle between the two countries and expect anything productive to happen. Either you fully back Ukraine materially and rhetorically, or you don't, and you let Russia do what it will. Flip-flopping only leads to a longer war, and while that does crush the Russian economy and military stockpiles, it also kills thousands more soldiers on both sides. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think the future of this conflict will look like. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.